guys, I'm Brendan Bohannon, and you can find me online at artisanbowlcarver.com or on Facebook as Artisan Bowl Carver. And today I'm going to talk to you about step-by-step how to turn this, which is offcut from a sawmill, in this case red maple, into a bowl. We'll talk a little bit about what you need, your basic setup tools, and then dive right into it. So the tools I'm using today are an 11 amp grinder, that's by DeWalt, the turbo plane carving wheel from the Arbortech company, just a standard quick clamp because they save a lot of time rather than the traditional clamps, even if the traditional clamps do clamp a little tighter, and a DeWalt sander with 3 grits of sandpaper. Today I'll use 80 grit, 120 grit, and 220 grit. And otherwise, total cost, all the tools here on the table, right around $250. However, you can get intro level tools through Harbor Freight and less expensive companies and be carving bowls today for about $50. So on that note, we'll kind of jump right in. I'll tell you guys a little bit about what I'm going to do and we'll start carving. So this is a piece of red maple. It was a sawmill offcut, and in this case it's good and dry. The bark was already peeling off, so made everything a lot easier. I don't have to spend time stripping the bark. My first steps will be to mark out kind of a base plan for the bowl. I'll knock off the angles I don't want, and I'll show you where all the spots I'm going to carve out will be, so I have kind of an idea in my mind. And then after that I'll start flattening, and once I've flattened it out so I have a nice spine for it to sit on so it doesn't wobble, I'll start carving the main portion of the bowl. So let's start out. We're going to take a Sharpie and we're going to mark out parts we want to keep, parts we don't want to keep. So let's see. We don't want any sharp corners, so I'm going to take off this sharp corner and this sharp corner. Maybe slice that one off right about there and right about here. And I will do all of this with the carving wheel on the grinder. I won't need a bandsaw or anything like that. So let's add some shape to this one. Let's have one that's got a little character to it. So we'll put a big curve here, dip it back into the center line here, around like that. So that'll be kind of the final shape of the bowl we're looking at. Again, I'm going to take off these corners, and then this will kind of stay, and take out the centerpiece for the bowl shape itself. Before we get to that part, the hollowing and shaping, what we're going to do, as you can see, it kind of rocks, so I want to make a nice flat surface to work with. So I'm going to take the bowl, or the beginning bowl, I'm going to securely clamp it to the table, and I'm going to shave off a nice flat spine to give me a comfortable place to carve from. We'll clamp right here. Lock it down with my quick clamp. It's not going anywhere. So we're going to jump right in. Again, this is the turbo plane and on an 11 amp angle grinder, and I can use it for bark stripping if I hadn't already stripped the bark, but in this case we're just going to go ahead and start flattening so we have that nice fine flat ridge and a bowl that'll sit even when we're carving. Switch my clamp and get my same flat on the other side, continue my spine, and then we'll see how it sits. let's check and see how it sits now. Yeah, got rid of that wobble. So as you can see, I can kind of poke around it. If I lift, it'll go. But as far as sitting, it's not just wobbling on the table. That's what we want. So we're gonna move on. I'm gonna start off with knocking these corners off using the turbo plane and move right in. So when I was grinding out the back, you saw me just use the turbo plane in a flat motion, kind of moving back and forth. And that was just to quickly remove material to flatten and smooth and to save myself time sanding later. For the corners, I have two methods I can use. I can either come straight down, and I use that a lot of times with dough bowls because it makes a nice curve that follows the outer curvature of the wheel. Or I can hold the grinder sideways and come across to shape. And I think that's what I'm gonna do for these corners, because I wanna have the roundness go here, and I don't wanna have an inward curve. So let's start on that. Two of the things I really like about the turbo plane are it is an extremely aggressive tool when you want it to be, but also because it's a cutting surface rather than an abrading surface, it can be finessed quite a bit and save a lot of sanding in the end. So you can see I use those pairing strokes to start edging off the corners and picking my basic outside shape. And that's something I would do regardless of whether I'm carving a dough bowl, a cup, a large salad bowl, or anything like that. In this case, I'm making one of the live edge log bowls. So I want to keep some of this natural curve and also not go with anything that's a uniform shape. I want it to have a lot going on when it's finished. So my next step will be to kind of follow this inside line and start hollowing the bowl itself. To do that, I'll be using fanning cuts with the grinder. My movement will be pulling, and that pulling will take me a nice gradual curve from the edge of the bowl to the center. I'll switch my cut and then come in from the same side opposite. And then in the end, smooth out the bottom to remove any ridges by passing back and forth just like a hand plane. So let's get it securely clamped and move on. Down good and solid. I'm going to start right on this side and start paring away. off a ton of chips, but it's throwing chips rather than dust, so it makes it much easier on me carving. Less of an overall mess when I'm done, and also a lot less need for a respirator or something like that. So as you can see, I've started the main carve here. What I did was use those little flippy paring cuts you saw to start with, just to clear to the depth that I wanted quickly and efficiently, and then started using longer, flatter strokes. And using it that way, I'm kind of duplicating what I would do with a chisel if I were hand carving this bowl, so I get these long, faired planes. And the faired planes can be left at the end for kind of a textured finish, or I can sand them out for a nice smooth finish. And in this case, I think I'm gonna go with sanding. So using the faired cuts will save me a lot of time in the sanding process of the bowl, and it'll save you a lot of time too when you're carving your own. So I'm gonna switch this out, and I'm going to finish carving out this side and then dive into the other side. Let's get this clamped securely again. I like these quick clamps because they get a pretty ridiculous amount of clamp force for a fairly small clamp. So now, as you can see, I'm going to start kind of following this line in and edge it in how I want. So a nice little trick you can pick up is your hands are extremely sensitive, just as much so as calipers, if not numerically for distances, but for feel itself. So what I like to do to make sure I have a nice even surface on the bottom is to close my eyes, and I'll follow the bowl, and I can tell you where the ridges are by feel rather than by sight much more accurately. So over here I have kind of the depth I want, but here in the center I have this tall ridge that I want to edge out, and I've got another little ridge here and another little ridge here, but the big concern is this central ridge. So what I'm going to do is take away from that central ridge and then make another series of those long paring cuts that are going to save me so much time sanding later. So you can see after those long paring cuts, I actually have a nicely faired surface. And if I chose at the end to not sand this or lightly sand it, the finish from the turbo plane itself is sufficient for an eating bowl or a display bowl, either one, as long as you keep the tool sharp. With an abrasive disc, of course, more sanding is going to take place and the faired cuts won't be necessary. But it's really personal preference. Some people prefer the abrasive discs because with the abrasive discs you don't have to be aware of blade orientation or grain orientation. You just grind wherever you want and end up with a finished product. So we're here, we've got the basic bowl shape I want. So I've used the turbo plane to shape off the corners at this point, and then to make these long faired grooves to save on sanding. And they make for a really fine surface. That fine surface will be excellent already if you want to eat off the bowl or use it for display, but of course can be sanded if you don't want to leave that sort of mark or if you want a super smooth finish. The other step that I've taken at this point is making a flattened surface for the back, so I had a smooth surface that I could clamp to the table and eliminate the wobble in the bowl. My next step will be to take the turbo plane, and I'm just going to use it very, very gently to go ahead and remove the mill marks around the edges. And I want to do that because it takes forever to sand them, and I really hate sanding. So I'm going to save myself as much time as possible and effort as possible with my initial tool, the turbo plane. And we're going to try and be sneaky and do this without clamping, but it may backfire. So I used the turbo plane and I got rid of the mill marks. This was milled on a bandsaw mill, so you get parallel marks the whole length of the board. And by doing that, saved myself 20 or so minutes of sanding. And that's something you can do when you're carving your own bowls. Just be very aware where mill marks or bandsaw marks or anything are like that. And if you can do a very, very, very light pass with your grinder with a planing tool like this, you can save yourself a ton of time. And that's possible only with the planing tool. If you are using one of the abrasive tools, probably the marks from the abrasive tool are going to be more aggressive than the saw marks already in the wood. So just be aware of that. My next step is I am going to take the grinder and very lightly go around the outside of the bowl and create just a little more inward slope the whole way around. And then I think what I want to do with this one is I'm going to show you guys how to add a small handle on each side, because this is a feature I tend to like on the bowls I make. And I feel like if I'm going to teach you to do it, I might as well teach you all the little secrets. So step one will be reclamping, and I'm going to make the motion of starting at the top corner and scooping kind of underneath so I get a nice natural curve out of using the turbo plane on the base of the bowl. So I'm going to clamp this so it overhangs the edge of the table, and that gives me plenty of working room. Clamp it nice and tight because we don't want it trying to run away from me. All right. You guys can see I've got my handy dandy sawdust catcher here. Keeps me out of a lot of trouble. So what I did with that step was I removed any saw marks from shaping the board, be it from a circular saw, a band saw, doing it with your jigsaw, or you know, just how it naturally came out of the tree. and I've created just the slightest little tuck under, so the bowl has a more natural bowl shape rather than kind of bowing inward. I don't know, I just don't like bowls like that. Something about the aesthetic of them bothers me. So you can kind of see where we're at now. We've got the roughed out bowl, we've got our rough shape we want, we've got our pull under. So the last step that I'm going to show you guys before we move on to sanding is I'm going to take the planer and I'm going to add these nice little undercut handles. So here we go. Now my next step, as you can see, I've taken the turbo plane and just kind of edged in this little natural finger groove handle. I do that so the bowl is very easy to pick up. So I can go here, reach my fingers under, lift, and then it still doesn't take away from kind of the natural curve of the wood. So I've got this cool little hidden handle effect. The turbo plane, once you've created a ridge, actually doesn't cut on the very outside edge. So I can use it as its own template to do this, and that's a very, very handy thing. Again, a great time saver and something that I've enjoyed about the tool itself. I'm going to do the same thing on this side. I want to make the handles, even though the sides are not equal sized, I want to make the handles about the same size. So this one is the length of the base of my thumb to my index finger, and I am going to do the exact same thing on this side right here. So that'll line up just like that. So I'm going to tilt it, clamp it, and go through and do it again. So I'm going to get a good secure clamp. I don't want it to move when I'm trying to do this. So I clamp it nice and good. And we brought this one in about to the first knuckle. So I don't like using measuring tools. I'd much rather, as you could see earlier, you know, I feel for depth and things like that. I want to be able to use my hands to find the things I need. So I use my hand as a visual measure. So now you can see I've created this handle effect on both sides. So my bowl's laying flat. It's very easy to come under the long orientation and pick it up like this. And then of course naturally the bowl had its inward slope there. But I wanted that to be something that would function the whole way around. So at this point I've finished the rough carving of the bowl. I could take whatever tool I've got on my grinder and finish this off and take this away, but I'm just going to do that with the sander. And as we go through the sanding process, you'll get to see what the bowl really looks like. Right now we have a roughed piece of wood, and at the end of the process you'll kind of see the final shaping. I tell my students a lot of times that your sander is actually your final sculpting tool. They think that all of the sculpting's done with this and then sander just might knock off a corner or something. No, the sander is a huge part of getting the final shape you want when you're a grinder carver. All right, guys, so we've gone through the roughing process, knocked off a lot of the hardest parts to sand and saved ourselves a lot of time doing that. So my next step will be to take my sander. I'm going to start off with 80 grit and smooth this surface down. I could have stayed with a faired surface, but I really want kind of a smooth surface for the bottom of this bowl because it's red maple and I think that's going to show up really nicely. I'll also use it to round over all of the edges and to flatten out any of the curves. So like I said a little bit before, I want my sander to be my final sculpting tool. So a lot of what you're seeing while I'm using the higher grit on the sander is also sculpting at this point. So I'm going to start off by doing this top surface and the inside of the bowl, and then I'll worry about rounding over the bottom. So you can see kind of a little bit of the progress here. My goal right now with the 80 grit is to get rid of any additional mill marks that I missed when I went over it lightly with the grinder, and also to get rid of any grain tear out. So this half's already been sanded, and this half I'll sand next. You'll notice I am not clamping at this point. Instead, I'd much rather have the freedom to move the piece around so I can get to each little corner and every little curve. Now we'll move on. So at that point, now you can see the top surface is sanded, the grain in the wood is really coming out, and you can kind of see what your end piece is going to look like in surface. So my next step will be to sand out the inside of the bowl, and then I'm going to round over these top edges. Something a dear friend taught me is that things will look more professional with rounded over edges, and sure enough, it's something that I've discovered at my sales and as well as just in my classes, that as soon as you round over an edge and break that surface angle just the slightest bit, the piece just looks 100% better. So that'll be the step that I take right after I sand out the center of the bowl here. So my goal at this part of the sanding process is to get rid of all the ridges and swirlies, both from the previous sandpaper grits and from the carving process with the turbo plane. So you can see where it's nice and sanded, all the grain comes out, there's no scratches or swirls, and then over here, there's still this ridging, the scratching and the swirling, a little bit of grain tear out, and that's what I'm trying to get rid of. I want to leave this surface nice and smooth, so when I move to the finishing grits, from the 80 grit I have now to the 120 grit and then the 220 grit, I get a beautiful finish at the end rather than having discolorations from having unevenness in the grain and unevenness in my layers. at this point, I removed the deep scratches from the carving process and then moved on, gotten rid of all the divots. I have a basically smooth surface, both on the top and in the bowl of the vessel itself in the basin portion. And now I'm gonna round over these top edges, and then I'm gonna flip it and immediately go ahead and round over the bottom edges, and then come back and sand out the sides of the bowl. So I mentioned before that rounded over edges make for a professional piece. And if you look closely, you can see this already looks 10 times better just from having the rounded over edges. So remember the importance of that. Now I'm gonna round over the bottom edges, come back and round the sides, and then finish smoothing the bottom of the bowl. Right, you can see the nice clean line where I've broken over the edges of that bowl. And now I'm going to go back along each side and make sure I have a nice smooth surface to work with for my next grit of sandpaper down, and then finish by sanding the bottom of the bowl. So what I've done here, I've smoothed over all of these sides. I'm getting ready to do the big side, but I wanted to go and feel and see if I had to go back and re-smooth anywhere. And it seems like I have a nice 80 grit surface. You'll actually be able to feel kind of a graininess to an 80 grit sand, but it's still smoother than the base carve, so I'll actually be able to feel any variations both in the height of my carving and in the roughness of the sanding at this point, which is a huge advantage when you're looking for where you want to make sure you have a perfectly smooth sand. A quick tip to remember too, if you're having trouble feeling like you're getting the proper amount of cut out of your sand, make sure that your sandpaper edge is still fresh. So if you start sanding and the grooves just aren't coming out, make sure you have a good cutting edge on your sandpaper. And also, it's perfectly okay to tilt your sander just a little bit. And you see me do that throughout the piece, both on the inside of the bowl and on the surfaces. I'll tilt just a little and pull, so I'm getting a much more aggressive edge than all of the cut spread out over the entire piece of sandpaper. All right, now we're going to sand out the bottom of the bowl. So you guys can see, I'm about halfway through sanding the bottom of the bowl, and it had some neat little worm trails and bug trails just underneath where the underbark would have been. And I didn't want to sand those completely out, so I'm actually going to lighten up the sanding process on the sides and leave that as a feature on this bowl, because I think it's going to be really cool once the oil hits it on the final bowl. So now I'm going to switch out, sand this side so you guys can see it, finish the other handle, and then we'll move on to our next sanding grit. So I finished the 80 grit sand. Now I'm going to feel over the bowl and make sure I don't find any divots or rough spots. I find that this really helps me because it saves me from having to come back to 80 grit and then sand through 120 and 220 again. So if I feel a rough spot, I'm not going to be afraid to go back and sand just a little more on that spot, like right there, to make sure that I have a smooth finish at the end. much better. All right, so my next step will be moving to the 120 grit sandpaper. I'll spend about half as much time sanding with the 120 grit as I did with the 80 grit, and half that again with the 220 grit for my finished sand to just get a nice smooth surface. Our goal, of course, is to make a vessel that is usable. So you don't have to worry about it being sanded down to 1,000 grit or 2,000 grit or something like that. You want it about a 220 grit finish, sometimes 320 grit, and then you have a nice, smooth, comfortable finish for home use as a serving dish, a breadboard, or really anything else. All right, so I'm moving on to the 120 grit. I'll spend about half the amount of time with the 120 grit as I was with the 80 grit, and you should be able to actually see a visible difference after I finish this sand on the surface. Alright, so I have the surface sanded down to 120 grit, and what I'm going to do now is go and round over the top edges again, hit the sides, and round over the bottom edges again. Again, because things will look more professional when you get that round over to the edges. So we're going to do that again manually with a sander. We're not going to use a router or anything crazy like that. And we're going to do that at every grit, 80, 120, and 220. that's the top sanded and rounded over. Now I'm going to switch out, and I've also sanded out the sides. You can see I'm feeling the piece to make sure that I haven't left any surface spots that are rougher. I can still kind of feel the difference between 80 grit and 120 grit, so I'll be able to tell that with my fingertips. Now, my next step will be to round over the bottom and finish sanding out the bottom, and then we will finish sand at 220 grit, which will take about half the time this does, and then we will put our food safe finish on here, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Alright guys, so now we've finished over the bottom and done all the rounding over with the 120 grit. And I'm going to feel over the piece to make sure I don't feel any weird rough spots. And then we're going to move to 220 grit, which is our finished sand grit, and then we'll go through and apply our food safe finish. Alright guys, so now I have 220 grit sandpaper on my sander, and what I'm going to do is just go through the whole process all over again. Sand the top surface, sand out the bowl, round over all of the edges, and sand out the bottom. And I'm going to do this in one long go, since we've been through all of the steps, and just let you see me go through it unbroken like I would if I were working by myself. And then we'll talk a little bit about the end of the sanding process and finishing with food safe finish. right guys, so now we have our bowl sanded down to a final 220 grit finish. And our next step will be applying our food safe finish, which we'll move on to. All right guys, so now we've sanded the bowl down to 220 grit and we're going to apply our food safe finish. I use walnut oil. This is a culinary grade walnut oil. You can get it fairly inexpensively at any natural foods market. Your other options are flaxseed oil. The reason I like walnut oil and flaxseed oil is they are hardening oils. So what will happen is they'll pull down into the grain and they'll harden rather than staying oily in the wood like mineral oil. If you want a really gloss finish when you're totally done, you can also apply beeswax, but keep in mind that if you use a beeswax finish and you want to re-oil later, absorption is going to be less. So for food stuff that you tend to use a lot, I would suggest just a walnut oil finish and refresh every month or 2 months if you want it to stay super fresh. One application is enough to last you a long time, but you will develop a patina over time if you don't keep reapplying. So here we go. I'm going to pour a fairly generous amount in the center of the bowl and then just use a cloth to wipe it in. You guys watch how much the grain comes alive with a little bit of this oil on the red maple. Depending on the piece you're oiling, it may drink a lot of oil, it may just take a little bit. Moisture content in the wood will make a difference, as well as if you're using a spalted wood or something like that, the rate of decay before you started working on the piece. So you'll find that spalted, especially heavily spalted woods, drink a lot more oil than something like this, which didn't have any spalt going on, was a nice straight grain piece, and was at just about the perfect moisture content and time to dry. Yeah. So you can see now it's all oiled up. All of the grain is popping out. It's just a beautiful piece of wood. This one just took 1 coat of walnut oil. What I'll do is I'll let that soak in typically overnight, and then it is ready to serve food on or to use as a display piece. I was really happy with this one when I got to carving into it. I saw this kind of natural bug distressing, so as I told you guys, I left that in there. And that's a feature that will really increase the value of the piece if you're making these for craft fairs or to sell, or also something to just make it super special if you want to give it to someone as a gift. All right, guys. So at this point, I want to leave you with some final thoughts regarding carving as a hobby and things like that. First and foremost, don't be afraid to just go get a grinder and a wheel and start doing it. The way I started is one day I said, I want to carve a bowl, and I went and got a grinder attachment and started carving a bowl. And from there, it kind of took off, and this became my retired job to my full-time job. So now I carve bowls and teach classes. Some other key points to remember: don't be afraid to pick up a weird piece of wood, like an old piece of barn wood or an offcut from a sawmill or something with some bug holes in it. You know, you want those things with saw marks or interesting features or things that are really going to set it apart. One of the really great things about being a grinder carver versus a lathe turner is we get to make bowls with all of these beautiful funny shapes and curves, and you know, we're not trapped on a circle or trapped on what'll fit on the chuck of a lathe. If I wanted to carve something, a bowl the size of my car, I could do that. It would take time, but I could do that. And that's just not something you're going to be able to do with a lathe. So, you know, grinder carving has its own special little niche. It's a ton of fun. And for the most part, it's so different, you know, even from carver to carver, that you're going to end up making art and making beautiful pieces. And that's what I want to see everybody do. In this video, I took you kind of step by step through my method on carving a bowl from a sawmill offcut to this finished product, which I would say would be about a $100 bowl at a craft fair or something like that. And I want you to be able to make the same thing, you know. And if you go through and you feel like, oh man, you know, this is kind of difficult, or I missed something in the video, you're welcome to contact me with questions. But also, if you're not comfortable doing it at home or don't feel like buying the tools and you'd just like to make a bowl someday, get in touch with me. I teach classes, I travel and do workshops, and I am more than glad to come and bring tools and wood and equipment for your local group and let you try it out yourself. And at this point, I'd like to take some time and thank my sponsors for today and give them just a big shout out and some appreciation. That is Skillville in Johnson City, Tennessee. You can find them on Facebook and their website, www.skillvillejc.com. And they are super nice to me. They let me host classes here as well. They have a fully functioning wood shop, completely stocked out. They've got a metal shop. They have room for craft space. If you come in, you want to build anything, from a pencil holder to a farmhouse style dining room table, they are here to help you at any time. My business is Artisan Bowl Carver. You can find me at artisanbowlcarver.com or on Facebook as Artisan Bowl Carver. And drop by, leave me a comment, send a message, tell me what you thought of this video. And I appreciate you all so much for watching. Thank you for being interested, and I really hope that you jump in and start carving bowls.